The non-belief is incoherent omnibus. Number 1. The argument from skepticism. Premise 1. Belief should be apportioned to the evidence. A wise man, therefore, proportions his belief to the evidence. David Hume, 1748. Premise 2. Beliefs are propositional attitudes that manifest in reality as corresponding neural activity. A propositional attitude, then, is the mental state of having some attitude, stance, take, or opinion about a proposition or about the potential state of affairs in which that proposition is true. A mental state of the sort canonically expressible in the form SA that P, where S picks out the individual possessing the mental state, A picks out the attitude, and P is a sentence expressing a proposition. Premise 3. It is asserted that non-belief in the existence of deities, not BP, does not equate to or imply belief in the non-existence of deities, B, not P. To be clear, atheism is not a disbelief in gods or a denial of gods, it is a lack of belief in gods. Premise 4. There is insufficient evidence of a difference in neural activity between believing a proposition and believing its negation. A distinction in the neural activity that corresponds to non-belief and the neural activity that corresponds to disbelief or belief in the negation has not been substantiated, nor has any independently verifiable means to distinguish between them been provided. This is a distinction without a difference fallacy. A distinction in the concepts does not substantiate a difference in the phenomena to which the concepts refer. This is a reification fallacy. A distinction in the terminology does not substantiate a difference in the phenomena to which the terms refer. This is a semantic fallacy. There exists a concept of instantaneous travel from one location to another. We have a term for this concept, teleportation. Neither the concept nor the terminology makes teleportation real. Non-belief is no different. Conclusion. Therefore, one is justified in the dismissal of the assertion that non-belief, not BP, does not equal to or imply belief in the negation, B, not P. I understand the concept of non-belief just fine. I simply have no reason to think it exists beyond being a hypothetical abstract concept. Conversely, I have many reasons to think that it is bogus. A distinction in neural activity that does not manifest in reality is indistinguishable from a distinction that does not exist. Because there is insufficient evidence to substantiate its existence, I am justified in dismissing the assertion. As this is not my claim, and I do not assert the non-existence of this distinction, this is not burden shifting, as I do not have a burden proof to shift. The onus is on those who make this claim to support it, and this cannot be eschewed by magical hand-waving woo. If you cannot show how you know a claim is true, you cannot show that you know it's true either. You shouldn't claim that you do know it, and you wouldn't claim to know it if you actually care about the truth. And no, your appeals to personal anecdotes, faulty analogies, and logical fallacies won't change this.
The argument under examination attempts to challenge the distinction between non-belief and disbelief by appealing to epistemic principles and neuroscientific findings. However, a closer analysis reveals several flaws, including misrepresentation of sources, logical inconsistencies, and selective skepticism. Let's examine the first premise: belief should be apportioned to the evidence. This premise appeals to Hume for support, but the cited quote is taken out of context. The full passage states, "In our reasonings concerning matter of fact, there are all imaginable degrees of assurance, from the highest certainty to the lowest species of moral evidence. A wise man, therefore, proportions his belief to the evidence." The omitted portion is crucial because it clarifies that belief exists in degrees rather than a binary state of either accepting or rejecting a proposition. This contradicts any implicit assumption that belief must be either fully adopted or denied outright. Instead, Hume acknowledges varying levels of confidence, which is an essential nuance missing from the argument. Furthermore, invoking Hitchens' razor, what can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence fails to support this premise. Hitchens' razor applies to claims, not to mental states like non-belief or disbelief. One cannot meaningfully dismiss a mental state as if it were a claim requiring justification. The inclusion of this principle confuses epistemic standards for evaluating propositions with descriptions of psychological attitudes. A more charitable version of premise 1 might be: belief should be apportioned to the evidence, meaning that one should not accept a claim as true unless the evidence sufficiently justifies doing so. This avoids misrepresenting Hume, since he did advocate proportional belief rather than outright dismissal. And it correctly aligns with Hitchens' razor: lack of evidence can justify withholding belief, but it does not automatically mean belief in the negation is warranted. Now, let's turn to premise 2. Beliefs are propositional attitudes that manifest in reality as corresponding neural activity. To assess this claim, we must first understand propositional attitudes, mental states that express a person's stance toward a given proposition. These include desire, I hope that it will rain tomorrow. Despair, I lack hope that it will rain tomorrow. Dread, I hope that it will not rain tomorrow. Doubt, I doubt that it will rain tomorrow. Knowledge, I know that it will rain tomorrow. In epistemology, the most relevant propositional attitudes are belief, B, P. Accepting a proposition as true. Disbelief, B, not P. Accepting the negation of a proposition as true. Suspension of judgment. Not B, P, and not B, not P. Neither accepting the proposition nor its negation as true. This distinction is foundational in discussions of knowledge, skepticism, and rational inquiry. To further support the premise, the author provides a journal article from Function, Volume 4, Issue 6, Beliefs Made It into Science, Believe It or Not. However, the relevance remains unclear. Seitz and Palautzian do not argue that belief is merely a brain state. Instead, they describe belief as a multi-layered cognitive process shaped by perception, inference, and memory, not something reducible to neural activity alone. Their view frames belief as an active, context-dependent process that involves subjective valuation and probabilistic reasoning, higher-order cognitive functions that transcend mere neural activity. If this article is being used to argue that belief is nothing more than neural activity, then it has been misrepresented. Rather than lending straightforward support to the premise, Seitz and Palautzian's work actually undermines any simplistic neural reductionism, making its inclusion in the argument irrelevant or even counterproductive. Personally, I find premise 2 as written implies a mystical and idealistic interpretation where beliefs can become real concrete things. This runs counter to my own understanding of reality. I can't hold a teaspoon of love. So in attempt to be more charitable, I could interpret premise 2 as beliefs are propositional attitudes that correlate to certain neurological activities. This doesn't make the premise more relevant, but it does remove the word manifest, which carries mystical implications. Now, we reach premise 3, it is asserted that non-belief in the existence of deities, not B, P, does not equate to or imply belief in the non-existence of deities, B, not P, dot. Strangely enough, this premise serves no clear function in the argument. If the argument were attempting to refute premise 3, we would expect reasoning or evidence showing that non-belief actually does imply belief in the negation, but no such argument is provided. Given the author isn't directly asserting anything, I could reject the premise as invalid or irrelevant. The basic epistemic principle expressed is widely accepted and grounded in logical distinctions between belief, disbelief, and non-belief, and doesn't need to be defended further. The core of the argument seems to be premise 4 and the conclusion. It seems to say, if there is insufficient evidence of a difference in neural activity between believing a proposition and believing its negation, then one is justified in the dismissal of the assertion that non-belief does not equal or imply belief in the negation. However, this reasoning is fundamentally flawed. The author's reasoning lacks compelling force unless we accept the unstated assumption that if there is no neuroscientific evidence for a distinction, then the distinction does not exist. This reasoning is of course fallacious, and an implicit argument from ignorance. The author is making a logical leap from the lack of evidence for the distinction between belief and disbelief to dismissing the distinction between non-belief and disbelief, which is not warranted. The lack of empirical evidence for one distinction doesn't undermine the other, especially when they are conceptually distinct. Given the most charitable reading of the argument, I could conclude that while propositional attitudes correlate to certain neurological activities, I should suspend judgment whether belief and disbelief correlate to distinct neurological activities. This doesn't mean that belief and disbelief are not distinct conceptually, logically, or even in actuality neurologically. Just that I suspend judgment. And it says nothing on my understanding of non-belief, or non-belief in the existence of deities specifically. The conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, and the argument fails. Consider the case where neuroscience does in fact fail to find a clear distinction in neural activity between belief and disbelief, would this invalidate the propositional attitudes themselves? The argument is selectively skeptical in this manner. It does not apply the same inference to other propositional attitudes, such as belief versus non-belief, desire versus despair, desire versus dread, belief versus desire, etc. Consider the case as well where one accepts that they are justified in dismissing the distinction between non-belief and disbelief. If one does, then they would be unable to proportion their belief to the evidence, specifically in those cases where a lack of sufficient evidence would necessitate withholding belief. This would contradict Hume's own position. The content of the assertion within premise 3 could be a contradiction, but only if the one accepts the content of premise 3 and the justification to dismiss the distinction. Being wrong isn't interesting or compelling. These internal contradictions render the argument logically unpersuasive, and the lack of rigor in reasoning makes it uncompelling. Ultimately, the argument fails to establish that non-belief and disbelief are indistinguishable. It selectively applies its inferences while ignoring broader implications for other propositional attitudes, misrepresents epistemic principles, and makes an implicit argument from ignorance. Even if neuroscience finds no clear distinction in neural activity between belief and disbelief, this would not negate their conceptual and logical differences. Therefore, this argument isn't a justification for dismissing the well-established distinction between non-belief and disbelief, and the argument does not hold up under scrutiny. Postscript. The exercise in refutation is to use the argument and whatever sources included to show how the argument doesn't work. However, I was able to gather resources to directly refute premise 4. Here are my conclusions. This paper, Functional Neuroimaging of Belief, Disbelief, and Uncertainty by Harris, Sheth, and Cohen, 2008, directly undermines premise 4 by providing direct empirical evidence to the contrary. The study found that belief and disbelief engage distinct neural pathways, particularly in the prefrontal and parietal cortices. It explicitly states that belief, disbelief, and uncertainty activate different regions of the brain, with disbelief engaging the anterior insula, an area often associated with emotional salience and even disgust. This means that rejecting a proposition, B, not P, is not the same as absence of belief in it, not B, P, but an active neurological process. Premise 4 is factually incorrect. There is neuroscientific evidence of a difference in neural activity between believing a proposition and believing its negation. The argument's conclusion collapses, as it is based on a demonstrably false premise.